Hello and welcome to Likhawat. I am Gautam Chaube and this is a show about the books of Bharat. The book this week is Vishwanath, the story of eternal Kashi. बनारस में बनारसी बाग हैं, बनारसी माघ हैं, बनारसी घाघ हैं, बनारसी जगन्नाथ हैं, शैव हैं, वैष्णव हैं, सिद्ध हैं, बौद्ध कबीर पंथी नाथ हैं। जगह जगह लगती है यहाँ लोक अदालतें, कहने को तो कचहरी भी है बनारस में, लेकिन यहाँ सबकी गवाह गंगा और न्यायाधीश विश्वनाथ हैं। Those were the sentiments of Ashtabhuj Shukla, a contemporary Hindi poet. Through the ages, Kashi of Vishwanath has been a venerated center of Bharatiya civilization, the setting for Upanishadic debate and the habitat of seers, seekers and countless pilgrims. Archaeological remains attest to the earliest settlements in Kashi going back millennia. Besides being the abode of Shiva, Kashi has also been associated with Vishnu, who performed great austerities at Manikarnika Ghat. The abode of Shiva in Kashi, the Vishwanath temple, was destroyed at least thrice over the centuries. But according to the Hindu theory of Sthana Mahatmya, a temple site remains a temple site forever. Vishwanath remains a symbol of faith, resistance, and of eternity.
Siddh bhajo omkar, ho siddh bhajo omkar, avadhu kaya manjan sarji, ho kaya manjan sarji.
Our book this week, Vishwanath Rises and Rises, tells the story of Shiva and his eternal Kashi. The author, Dr. Meenakshi Jain, is a historian interested in cultural and religious developments in Indian history. She has taught history at Gargi College, University of Delhi. She has been a member of the Governing Council of Indian Council of Historical Research and is currently member of the Academic Council, Nalanda University. In 2020, she was awarded Padma Shri by the Government of India for her contribution in the field of literature and education. Her recent publications include Vishwanath Rises and Rises, The Hindus of Hindustan, Vasudev Krishna and Mathura, The Battle of Ram, Case of the Temple at Ayodhya, Ram and Ayodhya, and The India They Saw. And joining us in the studio is the author, historian and acclaimed writer, Padma Shri Professor Meenakshi Jain. Welcome to the show, ma'am.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me start off with a question that concerns your scholarship, your body of works. You have written extensively about the temples of India. And the temples, as I see it, are not just sacred sites, but also play an important role in our everyday life. They also support local economy, trade and tourism. But they've also been witnesses to the sweeping changes in Bharat. My question is, how do you look at temples first as a person of faith and then as a historian?
Actually, I became aware of the importance of image worship and associated that with temples when I studied the Indus Valley civilization. And you know, it is remarkable that in the Indus Valley civilization, the archaeologists found many terracottas of mother goddesses. And they were very small terracottas, and they concluded that these were kept in the houses of people and were worshipped there. That made me first aware of the wide prevalence of image worship. And there are certain terracottas that were found at Mohenjo-daro which seem to suggest a kind of shrine. So from that, I turned to the literary evidence, Panini, Patanjali, Arthashastra of Kautilya. They all have details on image worship and temples. So, and moving on from there, the centers of image worship, when it actually gradually developed, were Mathura and Gandhar. So, this entire subcontinent was dotted with images, shrines, and later temples. Now, why I got attracted to this was that in the beginning of the medieval period, around the 11th century, this way of life, this form of worship, and this a very fundamental trait of Indian civilization suffered a severe assault. So that is when I paid a lot of attention to the fate of images and temples in the medieval period, and as you say, that formed a large part of my work.
Right. Ma'am, for all of us in Bharat, the land that we walk on is sacred. When we get up in the morning and before we set foot on the ground, we touch it and we issue an apology. Padasparsha Chamashvame.
Yes.
And then there are these places that are so sacred that their identity has become inseparable from the identity of the patron deity. I'm thinking of Mathura and Ayodhya. And you have one book on Mathura and 2 books on Ayodhya. You have explored the sacred geographies of India. And while we know generally the story of Ram's arrival in Ayodhya, the story of Krishna's birth and his Mathura, very little is known about how Vishwanath came to Kashi.
Yeah,
in one of your chapters, you talk about that.
Yes.
Take us through that interesting story, ma'am.
That's a very interesting story, and it goes back millennia. And it is a story that Shiv is married to Parvati, and Parvati's mother tells her daughter that, you don't even have a decent place to stay. And your abode, I don't like it at all. And you should find something more congenial. So Parvati tells Shiva that my mother is very upset at my place of residence. So let us find something more appropriate.
Which is in Himalayas.
Which is in Himalayas.
Right.
So the mother feels that that is not the appropriate place for her daughter. So in any case, they come and they look around and they come to Kashi. And Shiv is enchanted by Kashi and says, this is a place which I will never forsake. So this is the story of Shiv's arrival in Kashi. It is enunciated in many of the Purans, but the earliest Puran where it is enunciated is the Skand Puran.
Skand Puran.
Yeah.
Right, ma'am. And which in fact brings me to the next question. I mean, Kashi and Varanasi and Vishwanath, they've been subject of many studies, many lores, many folk songs and legends. And I can see you have pieced together the story of ancient Kashi and early medieval Kashi. What were your sources, ma'am, while you were working on these archives? And
it is fascinating because the amount of evidence is so rich. So, archaeological excavations were done in Kashi from 1940 onwards. So, there is a lot of archaeological evidence that we have. We have so many terracotta seals that were found there, and around 400 terracotta seals are there in the Bharat Kala Bhavan in BHU. And they provide such a lot of interesting information on the early religious history of Kashi. So we have seals which mention Shiv, and we have Vishnu, Vishnupad, Shankh, Chakra, and we also have surprisingly, or perhaps not so surprisingly, seals of Vedic schools.
Oh.
Kashi was a center of Vedic learning.
Right.
And there were many schools which were specializing in Vedic studies, and each school had a separate seal. So the seals of many of these schools of Vedic schools have been found at Kashi. Apart from that, we have a large number of literary evidence. You mentioned this, or I mentioned the Skand Puran, there are Matsya Puran, etc. And what I found very, very interesting is the first Dharm Nibandh that has been written in Kashi in the time of the Gahadwala kings by Lakshmidhar.
This is 11th century.
Yes. So that is a very, very detailed account of Kashi as it was in that period. So we have evidence of from Kashi of various kinds spanning various millennia.
Ma'am, on a day when we are discussing Varanasi, I cannot not ask a question on the Ghats of Banaras.
Yes.
For many of us, the Ghats of Banaras have been a metaphor,
Yes.
metaphor for continuity,
Yes.
for Sanatan,
Yes.
sitting placidly on the
Yes.
banks of Ganga.
Yes.
They have enchanted filmmakers and storytellers. In one of the chapters, you speak of what is probably the most famous ghat of Banaras, the Manikarnika Ghat,
Yes.
and how Vishnu performs his austerities
Yes.
on the ghat.
Yes.
Please tell us
Yes.
about its story.
That's a very, very fascinating story. Normally, we associate Kashi with Shiv.
Right.
But as in all other sacred sites of Hinduism, you will find other gods and deities also represented there. So Manikarnika was a place where Lord Vishnu performed great austerities. And you know, Shiv and Parvati came because of the power of the tapas and the heat of the tapas. They came to see what was happening, and they were enchanted when they saw Vishnu with performing these great austerities. And Shiv trembled in admiration, and his earring fell in the pond of where Vishnu was performing his austerities.
And this is Manikarnika Ghat.
So this is Manikarnika Ghat. And Manikarnika Ghat also has, you know, the places, the burial places.
Right.
So, you know, it is said that creation began at Manikarnika and it will end at Manikarnika when creation will come to Manikarnika in the form of the 5 elements. So, creation begins at Kashi and ends at Kashi. That is why it is called the Shamshan.
Shamshan. That's so fascinating. But when one thinks of Varanasi, one associates a mood of philosophical indifference, nonchalance with the city, a darshanik fakkadpan, Shiv hai to chinta kis baat ki. And at the same time, this city has also been a seat of ancient learning,
Yes.
of yoga, Vedic Shastra, Sanskrit scholarship. In 3 of your chapters of the book, at least, I see you've offered a detailed account of the scholars and the intellectuals who came to Kashi. Please tell us a bit about the great scholars of Kashi and their role in preserving and propagating the wisdom of Bharat.
But before I talk about the scholars who come to Kashi, I have to put on record that Kashi, you see, we have got the medieval period has occupied such a large space in our thinking that we forget that there's a greater Kashi that has to be reclaimed.
Right.
You see, the Veds, the setting of the Veds is regarded as northwestern India and Punjab. And the Veds were about rituals, you know, sacrifice. And then the location shifts to Kashi, and the important sites or centers of learning in eastern India were Videha, which is associated with King Janak, and Kashi. Now, the next stage of the Indian intellectual and philosophical development takes place in Kashi because that is the setting of the Upanishads. The Upanishad discourses take place in eastern India, and these Upanishad discourses, the new learning, actually is enunciated by kings of eastern India. They pronounce that Atma and Brahma are one. So, you know, this is a very great jump, and this philosophy has percolated so deep into the Indian consciousness that it's become part of our learning that Atma and Brahma are one. So, this is an important part of Kashi's contribution to the Indian civilizational journey that we should recall. Now, you talked about the intellectuals. So, I'm taking a big jump forward.
Absolutely. It's an encyclopedic question.
Yeah. So, I have to answer it in a very brief way. Now, what happens is in the medieval period, we have a very important development, and that is the arrival of 6 Maharashtrian Brahmin families from the Deccan to Kashi.
Right.
Now, imagine the situation, the time period, the conditions, and here are these families uprooting themselves and relocating to Kashi. Why? Because Kashi is recognized everywhere as the heartland of Hindu culture, religion, philosophy.
Is this in the 10th century?
10th, 11th century,
Right.
and they're not getting anything out of migrating from their homeland. But they feel that as the custodians, let me put it like that, of the civilizational and philosophical heritage, they have to be there. So you mentioned many of these people. I'll just mention one family, that is the Bhatta family. But all the families who migrated were illustrious families who made notable contributions. Now I'm mentioning the Bhatta family because it is so relevant and we can trace their history till today.
Right.
So Narayan Bhatt is the person who, along with Totar Mal, who was a revenue minister in Akbar's time, decides to reconstruct the Vishwanath temple, which is a subject which we can discuss later. But the Kashi Vishwanath temple was rebuilt in the 16th century in the time of Emperor Aurangzeb by this Narayan Bhatt and Todar Mal. Now subsequently, a great-grandson of Narayan Bhatt, Gaga Bhatt is his name, he assists Shivaji
Right.
or meets Shivaji when Shivaji is returning from Agra and helps him to reach the Deccan. And he actually is instrumental in presiding over the coronation ceremony of Shivaji, and Shivaji is Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj.
Right.
So this family, but the story doesn't end there. Now in January we had the Pran Pratishtha of the temple at Ayodhya, and a descendant of the same Bhatta family was part of the priestly group that
How wonderful.
presided over that ceremony. So, when we talk of the traditional intelligentsia of India, we have to appreciate and admire what sterling qualities they had and what deep commitment they had to their learning, to their profession, and to the culture of India. Over 500-600 years, they are remaining in poverty. It's not that they are being
Right.
invited by kings or
Right.
being flooded with wealth, but just that commitment to their learning and to their civilization. It is something which really, really inspires me and really thrills me, if I can put it that way.
In fact, we see that pattern also in the Sanskrit scholarship in
Yes.
Kashmir.
Yes,
But since we are talking about Banaras,
yes,
I'm also reminded of Goswami Tulsidas,
Yes.
another great scholar who settled in Banaras.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about his contribution to the city.
Tulsidas, we all know that he wrote the Ramcharitmanas. He was a resident of Kashi. But when he started writing the Ramcharitmanas, he went to Ayodhya to start it. And then he came back, and he is immortalized because of Ramcharitmanas. And what is very interesting is that in the 16th, 17th century, when the Hindu Rajas had arrived in Kashi, or they are the ones who helped to revitalize the traditional heritage of Kashi, and in that traditional heritage, the Ramcharitmanas plays a very important role, and 30 days Ram Leela celebration, that enactment of the whole of Ram Leela takes place in Kashi, and according to tradition, Tulsi himself participated in the first time that the Ramayana was being staged. So Kashi has such a rich heritage, and it is so central to our culture and civilization. It has Shiv, it has Vishnu, it has Ram Leela.
And all these intellectuals.
And all these intellectuals.
Right. But for these intellectuals to flourish for any at any place, there also need for patronage. And I'm thinking of the Maharajas of Mithila, of Travancore, and Mysore, and how they patronized the local intellectuals. So what role did the kings of Varanasi play in preservation of knowledge?
Before I answer this question, there is a historical inaccuracy that we have been taught by people who governed us at one time
Right.
and wrote our past for us.
Right.
The image that was given to us
Right.
of Hindu rulers
Right.
was a very negative image.
Right.
That they're debauched, they're backward, they're oppressive, and they're keeping down the populace and their subjects.
So the colonial accounts.
Which is why the British are the,
Right.
saviors of all of us. But it is so surprising that by and large, the Hindu rulers do not conform to this image at all. They were they were intellectuals in a sense. They were so skilled. Many of them wrote Dharma Shastras. They patronized learning. So, this negative image that we have of ourselves and of our rulers and of our culture, thanks to our colonial heritage, I'm glad that we are beginning to shed it and rediscovering our true selves. So, what was your question about?
The question is the contribution that the kings of Varanasi made
Yes.
in preservation and propagation
Yes.
and in patronizing these intellectuals.
Yes. You see that in the medieval period, obviously, Kashi was part of the Mughal Empire. Right from, it was actually part of the Sultanate also, but there were, contests. But from the time of Akbar till the time of Aurangzeb, we know that it was very much part of the Mughal Empire. So there were no Hindu rulers, if I can put it that way. The Hindu rulers of Kashi, they arrive, with actually Chet Singh. And of course, there were one or two people before him, they were landlords. But then Chet Singh, he gets the title of Raja. Unfortunately, he enters into a contest with Warren Hastings.
Right.
Because Warren Hastings wants him to give more tribute than he can afford. So he fights, revolts, and finally the Rajas are dethroned politically. So they don't have political power. But it shows a dimension of the Hindu Rajas, as you mentioned, that though they were divested of political power, how much they contributed to the revival of Hindu culture and civilization. And the Banaras Rajas are a sterling example of that. But the Rajas of Banaras that we identify as the Rajas of Banaras
Right.
only happen when the Mughal Empire gets into decline. So this family of Chet Singh, and they are divested of their political power because of the revolt against the East India Company. But that does not in any way hamper the contribution that they make to the Indian Renaissance, if I can call it. They're patrons of Braj poetry. They're patrons of, texts on the Ramayana. How many texts are written on the Ramayana? Retelling of the Ramayana, painting, music, and of course, the staging of the Ram Leela. So it is a regeneration, a revival, renaissance regeneration of the Indian cultural and spiritual heritage that the Banaras Rajas preside over at a time when they have no political power. So again, I want to say, when we decry Hindu rulers, we should re-examine what we have been taught. Because here is a family that did this.
In fact, there is a famous saying in Banaras and in the region about the conflict between Chet Singh and Warren Hastings.
Yes.
Ghode pe hoda, hathi pe jin,
Yes.
bhag gaya Warren Hastings.
Yes.
Which in fact, ma'am, brings me to the last question. The question of the temples of India. If you look at the stories of the temples of India, every story travels through many stages. It starts with a divine inspiration. Some Raja or a society comes together to build a temple. Then there is the phase of desecration. And then there is this phase of revival and resurrection. In fact, your book is titled Varanasi Vishwanath Rises and Rises.
Yes.
So what is the story of the resurrection of Vishwanath? And you've looked at this story in your book through the intervention of the Marathas and figures like Ahilyabai Holkar.
Yes.
Take us through this very important phase of the resurrection of Varanasi.
Yes, this is a story that is repeated not just in Kashi, but it is repeated in many, many sacred centers of India. That when a particular site or a particular temple is demolished, it is never forgotten. And it rises again and again, means that it is reconstructed, reconstructed, reconstructed. Now you gave the example of the Marathas. This is a very, very fascinating story. The Marathas, under Shivaji, were an ascendant power, and later on, under the Peshwas, they become a very dominant power in northern India. And they are so powerful that at one time, the Mughal emperor even becomes their prisoner. So they imprison the Mughal emperor. And the rise of the Marathas, it causes great anxiety and tension to rulers across the borders of India. And I can mention Nadir Shah and Ahmad Shah Abdali, who actually invade India to stem the rise of these powers. The Marathas are so far away from their homeland, and the most important civilizational quest that they have in North India is that they have to retrieve and recover and revive the holy sites of Kashi, Ayodhya and Prayag. And the Marathas, they kept meticulous records because the constant to and fro exchange of letters. Right. So the Peshwa Daftar has many of these records. So this is not hearsay. We have literary evidence, and we also have the will of a Maratha ruler, the Peshwa. So all the time, the Peshwas are telling their subedars or their commanders who are in North India, negotiate with the Awadh Nawab, because all these three holy sites fell in the domain of the Awadh Nawabs. So they're instructing them, negotiate with the Awadh Nawab for these three sites. Tell him we can make him Mughal Wazir if he agrees. And if he agrees only to Kashi, we'll give 50 lakhs. So this is the kind of intense negotiation that goes on. And, they try everything that they possibly can to recover these sites. And the amount of effort they put in, it's really absolutely remarkable. And the Marathas suffer a very terrible defeat in the Battle of Panipat, Third Battle of Panipat. And they're almost, to a man, that ruling class is almost wiped out. But within 10 years, they're back. And Mahaji Sindhya actually tells the Peshwa that, the English are fighting with Tipu Sultan. We will not render them any help if they do not allow us to build the Gyan Vapi temple at its original site. And we know Ahilya Bai, because the temple that she's remembered by is there. That corridor has been created. And so that is, and the one Peshwa, Madhav Rao, he was 25 or less than 30 when he died. And his will has survived. And in that will, he's telling his successors, you have to reclaim Kashi.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this very engrossing and enlightening conversation on Varanasi. And might I suggest that Varanasi and Vishwanath are never too distant from Indian imagination. And with that wonderful talk of yours, anyone who wants to visit the shrine will perhaps expedite their trip to Varanasi and read and learn more about it. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
I'm sure you've enjoyed today's episode. Next week, we'll take up a new book. We'll have a new guest in our studio. Till then, keep watching Sunset TV. I am Gautam Chaubey. Namaste.
To watch more programs of Sunset TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.